Hello there. I am Mariana Mazzucato. I'm a professor at UCL in the Bartlett. I direct an institute called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and we're very happy to welcome you today to a lecture series that we co-host with the British Library here called Rethinking Public Value and Public Purpose in the 21st Century Capitalism. What is public value? What is value? How is it co-created by different types of actors? We are very keen on this topic because many of us in the Institute are actually economists, and believe it or not, that word doesn't even exist in economics. We have the word value, but it's always assumed that that's created in the business sector, and you might have civil society organizations, which are important on the side. You might have government and different types of public organizations on the other side, kind of facilitating and de-risking the process, but the real dynamic of what a co-creation mechanism might look like between civil society, between business and public actors has really been under-theorized, and we believe this is a problem because then that also determines the kind of actions and activities we see out there in terms of the lack of real ambition in that space. And so we've asked pretty provocative questions in this series, like what does public even mean? Just because a space is free to enter, does that make it public? You know, Google itself, of course, is providing a free good. Does that make it a public good? Of course not. So it's been really exciting, actually, to bring together through this series different types of people from the arts, from economics, from government. We've had musicians, people running different types of public organizations like the BBC, reflecting on what it was like to actually be evaluated against public value metrics. It was great to open the series, in fact, with the CEO of the British Library who used to work in the BBC, Rolly Keating, where we discussed that whole issue of evaluation. So you might have heard of the BBC Charter Review. That's very important, and that concept of public value becomes very difficult and contested as well. Anyway, so we're so happy today to have Amanda Levete here with us, and Hadil Ibrahim is going to introduce her. She will also be chairing the discussion. We're very lucky because Hadil is an advisory board member, a very important one, of the Institute, and she was the founder of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which has also been extremely important worldwide in thinking about issues of governance. These issues aren't separated, right? How you actually value something and then how you govern it are obviously intimately related, and she hosted a wonderful discussion actually at her home this weekend around that. What does, how should we actually be governing public institutions in the cultural sector so that they really reflect what they're trying to do out there in the communities when they talk about, for example, inclusivity. Anyway, I will now hand over to Hadil and also thank her gratefully on behalf of the Institute for both introducing Amanda and chairing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure both, of course, to serve on the board of an institute as exciting as IIPP, but also to be able to introduce Amanda Levete, a great architect and a great friend. And before I say something more personal, let me discharge my formal duty and read the formal introduction. Amanda Levete is recognized as one of the most innovative architects of her generation. Her work speaks for itself: the Selfridges Department Store in Birmingham, the Lord's Media Centre, which won the Reba Sterling Prize in 1999, and more recently the Victoria and Albert Museum Exhibition Road Quarter. And I would like to add to that the Mat, my personal favourite, in Lisbon. All of these I'm sure you'll be hearing more about. Significantly, and I say this as someone very closely connected to the ICA, she won the Jane Drew Prize this year, which recognises innovation, diversity and inclusiveness in architecture. So already you begin to see the tremendous overlap between IIPP, Amanda's work, and the reason why we're here today. So in really thinking about public spaces, why they matter, the connections they make between people, and public value, I can think of no one better than Amanda. As Mariana said, I have spent many years working on governance issues in Africa, so many of the first conversations I had with Amanda were about public space. In fact, the first time I went to her studio, we immediately launched into a conversation about public space. And why does public space matter? I'm not an economist and I'm not an architect, but I can tell you that we know, and we have to be very aware, that civic space globally is closing. For those of you that have seen the Civic's annual report on civic space, freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, this space has been closing over the last 10 years. We are less able globally to associate. We are less able to express ourselves. We are less able to organize. And that's as true of Africa, where I've worked. It's as true of America after the Patriot Act. And it's true of this country, as you saw with 180 days detention not so many years ago. So civic space is closing around the world, and we have to fight for this idea of the civic. And the expression of that spatially, physically, through public spaces that make people feel welcome, make people feel that they exist and that they belong in the city and that they have some ownership of the city is more crucial than it has ever been. So while we may have been on different tracks, I've been so thrilled to work with both Mariana and Amanda because we're fellow travelers in the same direction. So having said more than enough, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Amanda Levete.
Well, thank you, Hadil. Thank you, Mariana, for inviting me. I'm going to talk about the importance of public space through the lens of my own work, if you'll forgive me. I will talk about it a little bit in a general context, but it's much easier for me to make a point through my own work and through the way that we think. I really believe there has never been a more important time for public space, because in these times of great societal, economic, and political uncertainty, people want to come together. People want to connect. And it's no coincidence that there's a huge rise in the popularity of music festivals, literary festivals, which where large numbers of people want to come together to share experiences. So the first project I'm going to talk about is the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology, MAT, in Lisbon. This is a really powerful example, in my view, of a very successful private-public partnership. This museum was commissioned, paid for, and is owned by EDP, who are one of the largest energy companies in the world, majority Chinese-owned. And they paid 21 million euros to build this museum. There were many people who argued, because you must remember this was constructed at a time of great austerity in Portugal. And there were many who argued that instead of spending money on a museum, that they should spend money on reducing energy prices. But it took a visionary CEO, who was my client, Antonio Mexia, to convince not just his company, but the public about the value of creating public outdoor spaces and cultural spaces. It's on the most spectacular site in Lisbon, on the river. The river, over the last 10 years, has been the site of quite a lot of regeneration and investment, but nothing kind of tied it together. And what's extraordinary about this site and about Lisbon is, although the riverfront is so spectacular and it faces due west and the light is just exquisite, it is completely cut off from the rest of the city by railway tracks and, in effect, a four-lane highway. And so when we were first given this commission, my first impulse was, can we use architecture to help reconcile a city that is cut off from its waterfront? And the first move that we made, and this was outside of our brief, was to propose that we design and build a new bridge that starts in a square on the other side of the railway tracks, at grade, is gently curved in plan because that's a structurally stable, stiff form, and that will land on the roof of the museum so that there are no steps, no ramp. One of the problems about Lisbon, although it's also the beauty of Lisbon, it's built on 7 hills, and it's incredibly difficult for the elderly and disabled to negotiate the steps. So it was really important to us that we started from a point of maximum accessibility. And this idea of landing on the roof of a museum immediately creates the idea, this notion of a new public space, a new public square on the roof. And from the roof, you then come down onto the waterfront. And that move, just the simple move of the curve, began to inform all of the kind of formal moves we made in designing the museum. It also has an important relationship to the substation, the old power station, which is now part of the art campus. But there is an existing substation that we had to keep open and integrate into the design, and that actually powers the palace. It was really important that that was kept in operation. This is not the bridge we've designed, I'd like you to know, but this is the opening day of the museum. On that opening weekend, 80,000 people visited the museum, and this is from a city that has a population of less than 500,000. And so many people cross this bridge, which is an incredibly inconvenient place because it's far from the museum. They have to walk back along the other side of the road. So many people were crossing that bridge that it had to be closed down because it was in danger of collapse. Our bridge is now finished. And this is the building on the opening weekend. And what you see on top of the building is not just some kind of decoration. That is people. And people just inhabiting the riverfront in a way that they hadn't before. We also create steps that come down into the water. It's very important if you want to create a meaningful public space, that you take account of the geography of the place, of the climate of the place, the light of the place, as well as the communities. And the building is very much a response to those issues. As I said, the light is really extraordinary in this part of the world. And we wanted to amplify that and create a surface on the facade of the building that would pick up the changing light conditions. We also were very mindful of having made a literal and metaphorical connection to the city with the bridge and the roof, that we kept the building as low as possible so that when you're in the old city looking across the river, your views are not impeded. And when you're on the other side of the river looking back toward the city, your views are not impeded. So we deliberately made it very low slung and low in relation to the rather powerful industrial architecture of the Power Museum. And so counterintuitively, because we could have gone higher, we had to sink some of the gallery spaces. This is the roof. Now, this has now become the kind of go-to destination in Lisbon. It's exceeded all our expectations as to its purpose. And we created steps that you can sit on. So for the first time, you can actually look back to the city. And this is a perspective that people of Lisbon have never had before. That is the view that you get from the roof. So you do have this metaphorical relationship as well now as a physical relationship back to the old city. And the way that the roof is used, it's used throughout the year, runners, families, just a place to hang out, a place to meet. And then, of course, when you're on the roof, it's the most wonderful point from which to look across the river and admire the sunset. These are the steps that we took down into the water because they flood at high tide, and it creates a very kind of visceral relationship with the the river. It's almost like the sea. You can smell the salt at this point, because just further out it becomes the ocean. And the building itself creates a natural overhang above the steps to the museum, and creates a very welcome area of shade. There's no shade along the whole of the waterfront, and because the climate in Lisbon is so wonderful, you very much need that shade. So talking about rooting in place and referring back to history, there's a very rich tradition in Lisbon, in Portugal, of ceramic tiles. And we wanted to have a surface that would just amplify and bring to life the extraordinary light that you can get. And so created a very sort of neutral backdrop in the colour. We did a lot of experimentation what colour the tiles should be, but it's a very neutral colour. And because it's a very long facade, we wanted to create a kind of pattern of the tiles that would have different readings depending on your vantage point. So occasionally they look like this. They have we put a crackle glaze on the surface of the tile. That's a very, it was something that was discovered in ancient China as an accident in the kiln, but it was seen as something of great beauty, and we now all know how to replicate it. It just means that when you get close up to the side, to the building and the tiles, there is a kind of depth, a layering that you might not be aware of from the long views. And it completely changes its persona according to the time of day. So this is in the early morning. This is what happens at sunset. The building turns golden. And then at dusk, it's almost black. And it's really interesting how people have appropriated not just the public space, but the building too, because the space and the building merge. This is a group of musicians who used the facade and the surface of the tiles as a musical instrument. And this is a wonderful moment that I wish we could say that we had designed, but we hadn't, but now I know how to do it next time. That there is this point at the top of the steps, which you can also get to by ramp. If you stand under the overhang of the roof, you can hear the sea amplified. It's a really rather beautiful moment. But this is a moment that we very consciously did design, which was to use the sun that hits the water, bounces off the water onto the underside of the overhang, which creates the shade, and then bounces down into the galleries, which are now below ground, through a roof light. This is during construction, but we structured the roof light and the geometry of it so that during the winter months, we can let in shafts of very dramatic sunlight. But during the summer months, when it's too hot, it's self-shading and it just lets in diffuse light. But it gives you this very clear reading between building and nature. You see the sky, you can hear the water, and you see the tiles above you. And this is the main gallery space. It's the oval gallery. It's what you enter. As you enter the building, you walk around on a gentle ramp into the smaller gallery spaces. And this was the first installation by Dominique Gonzalez Forster, where the visitor becomes the protagonist. And everybody who exhibits in this building, it's site-specific. It's never something that has been done before. And this is another piece by a Brazilian artist. Now, you pay, although it's a privately owned building, but it's public, you do pay €5 to enter the building. However, for €20, two people can have an annual membership. So it's a very modest entry fee. But does the fact that you have to pay, does that mean that it's not a public building? And these are some of the smaller spaces. Because it's where three disciplines collide, there is no formal division between the spaces, so the circulation becomes part of the galleries. This is a space specifically for video projections, and this is a space for emerging Portuguese artists. And social media is a phenomenon of our age, and it does inform people's collective perceptions of buildings as well as being the way that they share their experiences. And it has become a very Instagrammable building. Another piece of philanthropic architecture, if you like, this is in Melbourne. Naomi Milgram was my client, and it's a program that's based on the Serpentine Pavilion, but actually it's taken a step further because she programs it for 4 months, and then she gifts it's an annual commission, and then she gifts the pavilion to the city of Melbourne, and it is re-erected in a different part of the city. This is where it was installed originally in Victoria Gardens, and it was just a place for people to congregate, celebrating the kind of natural shelters that people gravitate to. And under it, you congregate, but you can still feel the wind and the light. And it became a place that was a venue both by day and by night, and is now installed in a part of the Docklands on a quite busy street. And I was nervous that this idea of it being part of the park would make it seem rather ludicrous, but actually it works extremely well in its new location. I just want to kind of ask the question, should we be more fluid and open about what public space is? In Asia, the mall, the shopping mall, is part of the culture, and it's always connected to transport systems, and it's often connected to housing. This is a building that we've designed and completed a couple of years ago in Bangkok. It's a 7-story shopping mall with a hotel above. But this is a space where families come together for a day out because of the climate of Bangkok. People want to be in air-conditioned spaces. Is the mall the new agora, the place where people come for commercial transaction to gossip and talk politics? It has a different meaning in Asia. This is a project we're doing in Paris for Galerie Lafayette Haussmann. And we've taken a position on this project to make it as much an urban project as it is about retail. And really, through the remodelling of the store, to break down the division between the city and the store, and try and make it a much more permeable experience. 37 million people visit this store every year. That's more than double the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre put together. So does that make it in any way a public space? How do we define what is a great public space? For sure it's a space that is sacred, that we naturally gravitate to express our feelings, to protest. But it has to be something more than that. This is Place de la République, and it's extremely successful, rather like Trafalgar Square, less successful, but both at the turn of the century, partially pedestrianised the area around it, and this has made a massive difference to the way that people use this space, and it has become the space of protest in Paris. But can the success of our public spaces, can they turn into something uncomfortable? If you think, I think particularly in the space outside of the National Gallery on Trafalgar Square or the place in front of Centre Pompidou in Paris, is it too overrun with tourists and hustlers? And does that make it uncomfortable for the locals? Does it disengage the locals? So how can we negotiate that really difficult balance? And I think in Place de la République, they've done something really clever, because they have kept it open enough to host thousands of people. But they've created different atmospheres, different pockets of feeling through the landscape. And somehow that has deterred the hustlers. And the last project I'm going to talk about is the Exhibition Road Quarter at the V&A. The Exhibition Road was one of the, Albertopolis as it was, is one of the most radical pieces of royal patronage there's ever been. After the 1851 exhibition, Prince Albert decreed that this would be a place of learning and culture for everyone. And this is unprecedented. You have Imperial College, you have the Royal Albert Hall, the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum, and the V&A. A really extraordinary walk from South Kensington Tube Station all the way to Hyde Park. And this was the commission that we had. Now, this is the group, the team, who realised the first building for the V&A, the Henry Cole building. And same place, 150 years later, oops, it's stuck. What do I do? Can I move? It's stuck. Maybe I go back. It won't go back. And this was a really good moment, a really good switch of slides, which is going to be so funny.
Yeah, you're good.
So 150 years later, my team and our engineers, same place. This is the site that we were given at the competition stage. It's between the Henry Cole building and the Aston Webb building. And it was a lost space. It had never been used by the V&A before. There was some porter cabins, it was virgin land. And no pedestrian from the street had any sense of the space because there was a big screen in front of it. In 1994, Daniel Libeskind won the competition for the same site with the Spiral building. Interestingly, it took 12 years for the demise of that project, which was longer than it took for ours to be constructed. But when the V&A finally pulled the scheme, and extraordinary, it got planning consent, and it's really quite interesting to look back. With the demise of that scheme, and this was before we had been invited to do a competition on the same site, for me that marked the moment, the end of building as icon. And that was very much in my mind when we started doing the competition for the same site. We took the completely polar opposite position. It was not about a building of bombast. It was about connecting the museum to the street and opening it up in a way that had never been done before, and being modest and being discreet and putting the gallery below ground. So when we presented the competition, we made this big play. We're going to break down the barrier between the street and the museum, and we're going to take the street into the museum, and we're going to take the museum out into the street. And by doing that, we're going to create a new civic space for installations, for music, but most of all for appropriation by the public. And this was the competition render that won us the commission. And it's very true to what has been built. The cafe in the sun, the oculus, and the opening of the screen. Opening the screen, of course, was a very daring thing to do, particularly at the competition stage. And it looks very settled, but it was far from straightforward. So this was the screen that existed. The V&A, I'm sure you all know, is Grade 1 listed, the highest level of protection, and rightly so. But the screen presented a completely impermeable and somewhat intimidating facade to the museum. And instinctively, we understood that for the courtyard to work as a truly public place, we had to alter the screen, and we had to alter the relationship between the street and the museum. It was a screen that completely concealed the elevations, and we argued that it was now about revealing rather than hiding. But when we went to the planners with our scheme, having won the competition and presented the idea, they simply said no. So we went away, chastened, but we didn't redesign the scheme. What we did is we redesigned the way we presented it to them. So we asked the V&A if they could lend us 2 researchers so that we could learn more about the history of the building than the heritage people knew themselves. And during the research, we unearthed this drawing. This is Aston Webb's original competition drawing for that site. And what you see is there is a very low screen. It's not quite as permeable as ours, but it's low. And behind it was a garden. And what had happened was during the construction process, they ran out of money. Same old, nothing changes. So the boiler rooms that were supposed to be housed below ground had to be housed above ground. And he changed the design of the screen in order to hide the boilers, which should never have been visible in the first place. Now, when we found that drawing, I knew we had them. And we gently presented back with huge kind of historical backup, and we won the argument. And this is what has resulted. So the base of the screen is now completely new. In fact, to construct the project, the entire screen had to be removed in order for all the plant and the diggers to go in. But you can now see this very different relationship between the street and the museum. A much more informal way of entering a museum. You don't enter up a flight of steps through a grand entrance. You enter into a space where you can just hang out. You don't have to go to the museum. You can have a coffee. You can just be there. But to do all this was hugely complex. We had to dig a basement 15 meters deep to create the gallery space below, which was the raison d'etre for this whole project. And we also had to prop 3 historic elevations to prevent them falling in while we were digging the hole. And we were literally holding up the weight of history. And the complexity of the engineering and the daring of the engineering, the audacity of the engineering, was so great that Cambridge University, who worked closely with Arup, who are the amazing engineers that we work with, and whose photograph I showed you earlier, Cambridge University installed, purely as a piece of research, at their own expense, into the tension piles that we had to dig 50 meters deep, because normally when you dig a deep basement, you put a slab on top and a huge superstructure, a multi-story building. But we didn't. All we had was a slab and a courtyard. So the slab wants to float, so you literally have to tie it down with these tension piles to prevent it from floating. And they did this because they believe that the movements that will be recorded over time may disprove the elastic theory, which is the theory that engineers use to calculate this kind of thing. And if that is the case, and we've already got some really interesting data coming through, we will have inadvertently advanced engineering knowledge beyond our wildest dreams. So this is the courtyard, the cafe in the sun. We persuaded the V&A to open the gates, at 8:30 in the morning. The museum doesn't open until 10, so that people can come and have a coffee, pick up a coffee on their way to work, hang out in the courtyard, or wait in the courtyard or in the cafe for the museum to open, rather than sitting on the steps on highly polluted Cromwell Road. We designed an oculus. The V&A is a very didactic institution in its ethos, in its collection, and in its buildings, and we wanted very much to follow that tradition. So the oculus, which allows you to look into the void of the gallery below, is conceived as though it were an empty museum vitrine. And what you are seeing through the oculus is the very structure, the folded plate, which spans 38 metres without columns. The folded plate, which is the gallery ceiling below and supports the very courtyard on which you are standing. And the balustrade around the oculus is deliberately low in parts so that children and people in wheelchairs have the opportunity for the same dramatic view as everybody else. So you can either take the ramp down into the museum. There's this big level difference between Exhibition Road and the entrance to the museum, or you can take the steps. And this, you're looking down into the void. But also there's this kind of exchange of conversation, if you like, between history and modernity. You see parts of the old building reflected in the new. And again here. And I don't know if you can see the next to the Aston Webb cupola is a concrete box. That is the lift overrun for the Lisbon scheme, which was put in anticipation of the project commencing. And by somehow reflecting it in the roof light, looking down into the staircase, it kind of references the painful and complex birth of this project. This drawing, if you like, is the kind of antithesis of the Instagram moment. It is a construction drawing of the courtyard, and it alludes to the complexity and the logistical drama that goes on below the surface of the courtyard, which you need in order to create a world-class exhibition space. But to really understand the courtyard, you kind of have to go into the museum first. So to make a new entrance into the museum, we cut 3 entrances. We just simply cut through the stonework with a rather kind of brutal cut. But by doing that, by taking something away, we've actually revealed something more. And we've revealed this really beautiful stone profile. When you go into the entrance hall, it's a very different experience from the kind of grandeur of the entrance hall on Cromwell Road. There's no big reception desk. It's interactive ticketing. We opened up the windows. We let the light in. And you are greeted by staff who come and ask how they can help you plan your journey. It's just a very different experience. And the security check is also in here rather than in the courtyard. Now, one of the most radical moves we made in the design, apart from altering the Aston Webb screen, was the decision to put the stair down into the gallery inside the museum itself. We're now in the existing Aston Webb wing. And the reason we did this was because we wanted to keep the courtyard as sacred a space as possible, unencumbered by all of the paraphernalia that goes with an entrance, and also to create the biggest amount of gallery space unobstructed by the paraphernalia of a stair. But more importantly, perhaps as a slightly more existential point, which is we want to make sure that the new gallery is never seen as an extension, but rather an intrinsic part of the V&A. But to do that was massively complex. We had to underpin a whole wing of the museum while the museum remained above, open to the public, with a priceless collection intact. There were vibration monitors all around the museum. Occasionally they'd go off, a little icon would flash on our engineers and our screens if the movement was greater than predicted. But we got there. And this was a kind of big moment. These are the beams and columns that are literally now supporting the weight of history of the upper floors of the building of the V&A. And originally in our design, we had imagined that these beams and columns would be white, that they would just disappear into the space. But I was so taken with this sort of visceral feeling of the power, the gravity of what these steel pieces were doing, that we decided to really emphasize that. And we painted them international orange. Now, international orange has its own provenance. It was the color that the first aeroplanes were painted so that they would be silhouetted against the sky. It's a color associated with industrial and engineering prowess, and it felt very apt. And we have 2 stairs, one to go up and one to go down. And this is partly to do with the numbers of people who come to the big headline shows, but it's also about the drama of ascent and descent. But it means that you can exit through the shop rather than enter through the shop. And my big critique of the V&A, if you come in from Como Road, is you enter the museum through the shop, and that's always felt a bit cheap to me. Now, when you go down, when you descend, it can be very disorientating. There's a great drama to going down, but we've made sure we kind of played with the daylight so that when you get to the bottom of the stair and you're 15 meters below ground, there is more daylight than at the top. It immediately puts you at your ease. This is the folded plate that spans 38 meters. It's an immensely complicated technical ceiling that includes all of the fire protection, the acoustics, the lighting, the AV hanging points. The last exhibition they had, they were suspending airplanes and cars from the roof. So it is hugely technically complex. And it's also very expressive. We could easily have done, in fact, all the other competitors did a kind of white box or black box, and we argued that is not the V&A. The V&A is a building full of character and expression, and there are enough white boxes around the world that will create something that has a little bit more drama. And this is the light that you get from the oculus. We've calculated exactly where the light will be at every hour of every day of the year, so that curators can choose to work with it or not. But curators are a very conventional bunch, and they're finding daylight really, really frightening. So a lot of the time, even though at many times of the year it's only diffuse north light, they are closing it off with the shutters that we designed. But I think one day they'll get a bit bolder. So you've been to the exhibition and you come up, and we're always very mindful to create this conversation between history and modernity, and it's that makes it feel, I hope, an integral part of the V&A, and to create views as you go up so that you're comfortable, you know where you've come from, you have this sense of orientation. And as you come up the stairs, it opens out in section, and this isn't a brilliant photograph, but you get a really wonderful view of this newly cleaned sgraffito wall that the public have never seen before. And then back out onto the courtyard, just to explain the kind of, for a public space to work, it needs to feel loved, it needs to feel that it belongs somewhere. So how do you root it in place? And sometimes a very abstract idea can drive a project, and that was the case here. And it was this notion, because the paradox of this project is the big event, the gallery is below ground and no one can see it. So we came up with this notion of how do you make visible the invisible? And we've done that through the oculus, through many little details, but could we find a way of capturing in the surface of the courtyard something that really reveals the complexity that is below it? So on the left is the three-dimensional folded plate that spans 38 meters. We took that and we flattened it as a surface, and from that two-dimensional surface we extracted a pattern and we rationalized it and created just 4 tile types, but it creates, by mixing those tile types, it creates a kind of color field of great visual complexity, which stops it just being an orthogonal grid of tiles. And we wanted to introduce color, and to have some reflection on the colour, but very mindful of people slipping. So how could we achieve this? And we started to research into ceramics. The V&A has one of the most important ceramics collections in the world, and we were taken around the collection by the keeper, who knows more about his subject than anyone. And it was extremely humbling. And could we capture something of these beautiful Chinese glazes that pool where the glaze is deepest? Could we incorporate that into the design of the tiles? So we started to do research. We got some research money from the government, and we started to look in Stoke, and then in Barcelona, and then in the Netherlands. Talking with makers, searching for a maker who had wanted to go on the same journey with us and wanted to test the limits of a material, because the V&A is about innovation and it's about discovery. And we came across Tickelaar, who are based just outside of Rotterdam, who are a family-based company. And they use porcelain rather than ceramic, but they don't use it it's never been used as a surface in a public space before, just as a faience material. So we thought, can we test the limits of porcelain together? Can we get it tested? Can we find what it is we have to add to make it non-slip? Because porcelain, although you think it's a very fragile material, you kind of associate it with, delicate porcelain china, it's incredibly hard. It's stronger than granite. It's totally vitreous, so there's no risk of frost. But what do we have to do? So 2.5 years of research later, research was only meant to take 6 months, but it took a bit longer. But the reason we had the liberty of that time is because of the phasing of the project and taking down the screen. We had the latitude to explore. It's very difficult to go to a public institution like the V&A and say, trust me, we're going to create the first porcelain courtyard in the world. We're not sure how, but trust me, I'm an architect. And they did. They wanted to know what Plan B was, and we told them Plan B was just a regular old, Portland stone courtyard, and we weren't even going to draw it because. But to enter into this kind of research, you have to collectively, and that includes the client as well, you have to collectively believe that you can solve the problems you don't yet even know exist. And that is why it took us a very long time. The whole factory was devoted to making these handmade porcelain tiles for months and months and months. And there you see the grooves. And because they are grooves, that's where we put the glaze. And the glaze can be glossy because your foot never touches the groove. And this is the result. The reason we wanted to use porcelain, it's so beautiful as a clay. It's this kind of whitish, bluish, grey, whereas the ceramic clay is more kind of biscuity. It just has a nuance that is different. And then we were so excited, having achieved the formula that went through all the EU testing that needs to be done to get something certified to use in a public place. We thought that we would extrude porcelain for the tiles of the cafe roof. But there's a reason people don't extrude porcelain, and that's because it doesn't work. But we tried, and we wanted to try because it would have been quicker and cheaper to use to extrude the cafe roof tiles. But I think we could maybe, with a bit more time, do it, but we failed there. So we went back to slip casting them in the same way. And we had a different glaze on these tiles, but the glaze on these tiles is so subtle that the guys who were applying the glaze couldn't remember and couldn't see if the glaze was on the tile prior to it going into the kiln. So they had to spray the tiles that they had glazed before they went in the kiln with a copper oxide, which then burns off in the fire. And there's something rather poetic about the kind of alchemy of all that. And I don't know if it's big enough to see in the resolution, but the tiles on the cafe roof do have this very sort of subtle glaze, which is different from the floor tiles. And then finally, having gone to all the lengths to alter the Aston Webb screen, although this is a public courtyard, it's a civic space, it has to be closed at night, it is owned by the museum, it houses a precious priceless collection, so it has to be secured at night. So we then faced the kind of paradox of how do we close it? And we tried any which way to do it, and it was nothing kind of had any meaning or had gravitas. We looked at glass that slipped into the electric gates that went underground. We looked at regular gates. Nothing worked. In the meantime, we commissioned a survey drawing because the screen, as I said, had to be completely dismantled. And every stone had to be mapped and numbered so that the stones that were going back could be put in the right place and the stones that were not going back could be kept for posterity. And when the drawing on the right came back from the surveyors, we knew how to do it. Because what that drawing shows, it maps the imprint of the shrapnel damage from World War II. So we then set about, and I say we because it wasn't me, my office, because I don't know how to do it, set about writing a piece of code that would calculate the different angles of perforation in these thick aluminium gates, so that from a certain vantage point, you can read the imprint, and you see it there on the mock-up on the right, the imprint of the shrapnel damage in the precise point that it was. And in that's just another example through a detail of making visible the invisible and memorializing absence. And you can also read it when the gates are in their open position against the new stone bases. There was an inscription after the war that talks about the enduring values of the museum surviving the Blitz, and we thought it would be beautiful to have another inscription that talks about the reference to the shrapnel damage and how that's picked out on the gates, and that is now there. And finally, we weren't asked, it was not part of our brief to include the Royal Crest. But Mark Jones, who was the then director of the V&A, said something to me that really stayed with me, and I was very moved by it. And he said, it's just important to remind people, and particularly our politicians, why this museum is here. And I thought, okay, this isn't a particularly beautiful rendition of the Royal Crest. Maybe we can make it more beautiful. And I think we have made it more beautiful and breathed new life into it. And we've made it bigger by this time just having perpendicular perforations in the central gates that pick out the Royal Crest. This almost looks as though, quite coincidentally, it could be from another age. But this looks like it's of today. And people use this space in different ways and unexpected ways. They inhabit it. It's a place where people just come to meet. I've seen people cycle there. It's not strictly allowed, but it's quite fun to do that. But, you know, as E.M. Forster said, our cities really only exist to only connect. And that's really the value of public space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I now have the absolute pleasure of moderating the Q&A. So I hope you've all been thinking about questions you would like to ask. The more contentious, the better.
Oh, don't give me a hard time.
So please be thinking, and if I see any hands up from the beginning. Immediately, yes, please. I think there's a microphone coming towards you.
Hello. Yes, I want to ask a question about the public space and the homeless people. I want to ask you, like, during your projects in the past, have you and your team ever considered about the other residents of the city, which are homeless people, and what's your attitude and how your project thinking about them?
Well, one thing I am absolutely against, and I find it hideous and wrong, is when people design seats that are designed not to be comfortable for lying on, and therefore not possible for homeless people to sleep on. it's an important issue, a question to ask, but I can't pretend that we've, in the two places that I've specifically shown tonight, the museum in Lisbon and the V&A, somehow the invigilation of those spaces and just the way that they're inhabited by the public doesn't attract homeless people. It doesn't mean to say that they're not, they're not welcome there. It doesn't have that community, as it were. But I think that when you design space with care, with sensitivity, but it's not just space, it's also buildings. I just came back from Sydney, and I know Sydney and Melbourne a little bit, and I visited their libraries, and their libraries are places that are so open, so welcoming, so tolerant, where many homeless people go to sleep or for shelter or for warmth. And they are accepted and they are welcome. They're given sometimes a coffee or something to eat. They're very, very profoundly democratic spaces where you have, students studying alongside people who are homeless, taking shelter and having somewhere to sleep. Of course, one would hope that there are places for homeless people to go, a place called home, but it's kind of beyond the remit of an architect when they're designing a public space.
Could I even maybe push it a little bit further and say, having seen the amount of research you've done around materials, is there the potential in dealing with, and we've seen, as you allude to, rising homelessness in London. And I'll give an example that I speak to. An institution I'm involved in New York, we wanted the institution, public institution, civic institution, to be free to enter. And we were told by city officials that wasn't possible because it would end up full of homeless people. And the conversation for us then became about what investment we had to make as an institution in our local ecosystem, because if you don't want the homeless people to be in your museum foyer, they have to be somewhere. So suddenly it created a whole different set of incentives for us to work with a soup kitchen, rehoming charities. You suddenly had to think of yourself in research terms and design terms as part of a much bigger area than the footprint of your building. And is that something that you could see entering into kind of the research practice of your studio? Or similarly, if to how you resolve those problems, not just through materials, but through kind of social infrastructure?
Yeah, but I think, yes, I like very much that idea, but I like even more the idea that you would make it mandatory for the developer or the institution to put aside some money towards solving a problem that was particular and local to that community, whatever it is.
Fantastic.
The kind of Section 106 is such a kind of sop. It doesn't, you never really know where it's going. You never know how it's spent. And I think that could be a very interesting way of looking at things. Many years ago, as Future Systems, we actually did a project which came to nothing because we couldn't find the interest, where we took London barges and built a simple superstructure on top for homeless people, and being, thinking that, moored on the river, that this was a kind of smart way of dealing with what you hope will be a temporary problem. I don't know. Maybe we should revisit that, because it was a very, it was an idea that could easily and cheaply be realised and could give great comfort to many people.
Can I ask if we have another? Two questions at the front. I'll start with Alan.
So you said that the Lisbon scheme was 22 million.
21 million euros.
21 million. 21 million for the Lisbon scheme. That seems remarkably good value.
It is rather.
It's a very, very cheap building. Have you ever been subjected to value engineering?
Oh, of course. And that building was heavily value engineered, as was the V&A. In fact, I've never worked on a project that hasn't been heavily value engineered. It's part of what you expect. But I think that, you know, part of our responsibility as an architect is to be persuasive, and when you know the budget is not sufficient to meet the ambition of the project or to meet the quality that is demanded by the project, you stand up and be counted and you push for it and you make yourself incredibly unpopular and try and win the argument. And there's always that dynamic and that issue around building projects. It's the idea that you can, through procurement and through design and build, put all the risk on a contractor, and it's only going to cost that and nothing more, and it'll look exactly like the renders. It's a fallacy. The building is too complex. It doesn't work like that. Everybody has to work to minimize the risks, whatever they are, whether they're technical risks, whether they're cost control risks. But there's a risk in not putting enough money to a project that needs to stand the test of time.
Can you just say something about the public value words that are on the pop-up there, and how that relates to value engineering?
And maybe say a word or two about value engineering to avoid being too jargon-driven.
Okay, value engineering is basically when a building project comes in over the estimated budget, and remember, you know, it's only estimated, and it's very difficult. It's particularly difficult to estimate things when they're innovative. And they've not been done before. And most buildings, other than kind of commercial office blocks that are just kind of repeated, or housing that's kind of rolled out like that, they're one-offs. So the idea that you can accurately predict the outturn cost of a hugely complex project, especially something like the V&A or Lisbon, where you're going below the water table or you're digging down 15 meters. It's, you know, the capacity for unexpected unknowns is huge. Innovation, innovative thinking can certainly reduce costs. And I think, you know, you look around the world at some buildings and you can tell where some buildings have just had, you know, the budget has been too great. And if the budget is, shouldn't be saying it, but if it is just profligate, it doesn't make you think hard enough, and that shows. And you need to make everything work. You know, we live in a time of, it's a kind of new sobriety, and we have to be responsible in the way that we spend money. But it doesn't mean that you have to do things cheaply. You just have to do things more cleverly.
And can I ask, in that context, when talking about the times in which you live, what's striking, maybe watching your presentation, you know, these buildings all have a tremendous kind of elegant simplicity about them, but are underpinned by remarkable complexity. And, you know, what's been interesting for me to see that degree of complexity made explicit. And is there are you ever tempted in any way to articulate that complexity? Because, as we know, you know, the moment in which we live in is one in which our political leaders are implying that the world is more simple than it is. And maybe we need to be re-embracing complexity and nuance in public life. And so is that, you know, having produced these kind of beautiful, seemingly effortless buildings, to your credit, which you can tell are a product of extraordinary effort, how do you negotiate that? Or is the nuance something that's totally experiential? How do you negotiate nuance and complexity, and the sheer rigour and discipline of your craft with that kind of simplicity?
I think it's an extremely clever question, and it's something that I think about quite a lot, because I think there's a great art in taking a very complex idea, a very logistically complex problem, and making it appear simple. And it's quite beautiful if you can do that. However, there's also, and that's why I put up the construction drawing of the courtyard, comparing it to the kind of Instagram simplicity. I do believe that if you invest a project with thinking and narrative, and a lot of what we do comes out of the narrative of the geography of the place, the history of the place, the community of the place, that it is kind of intuitively understood, not maybe in a literal way, because you can't go around explaining your building to everybody. But I think if you to take the V&A as an example, and you look at the courtyard, there's something there. You can't, it has to be a reason. It's not just this kind of crazy, complex pattern. It kind of makes you think. And I think once you go into the museum, you go down to the gallery and you look up at the structure, and you've seen the structure also through the oculus, that maybe that you can kind of begin to piece those things together. In your mind.
And experientially.
Yeah.
And certainly that was the experience I had in enjoying it. I noticed Mariana had a question, if that's allowed.
Of course, I'm the boss. So you talked about innovation, and that the V&A itself is such a innovative, it's a museum actually that exhibits innovation throughout history, and your work itself is so innovative, and innovation has to be financed. And your work internationally has obviously been financed by different types of actors and organizations. Can you just reflect a bit on whether there's any feedback on sort of the characteristics of the financing actor and or mechanism, and then what actually gets done, not just in terms of the final product, but especially those processes that you talked about, the willingness to embrace uncertainty and risk, and the long-termism, the short-termism, just how you've lived it through particular projects?
Well, I think, it was a huge privilege to work with an institution like the V&A. I'd never worked with a public institution before. And I don't think that there is any way that a private organisation would, A, have taken the risk of asking in the first place, with all the kind of planning risk. They would have looked at the engineering complexity and seen that that was too great a risk. And the idea of a porcelain courtyard that had never been done before, forget it. So it needed an institution to whom it matters, to whom the ethos of an idea that the provenance of materials, the provenance of an idea, if you like, that it is part of their being. It's part of their didactic. And the V&A certainly had that. And I'm not, don't imagine that we just walked in and it was kind of easy. There was a lot of persuasion, and when things don't quite work out the way you think, and they take a bit longer, or they are a little bit more expensive, it tests your relationship with an institution, but it deepens it. And when you come out of that, you come with a new mutual respect. And what I love most about being an architect is when you get a commission, you enter into a completely new world. I'd never done a museum before. And you enter this world, and you enter the kind of Byzantine complexity of their decision-making processes, which are slow and kind of Neanderthal. But if it hadn't been for that, we would never have been able to do the porcelain courtyard. So what I found at the beginning of the process working with the V&A, hugely frustrating how slow decision-making was. Partly it was, and it was right, that because it's a public institution, every decision is forensically analysed. Is this for the public good? Is it worth the money? But it's important. I can't remember the other bit of your question.
Just that feedback, I think, because we've seen this in the biotech sector, for example, which is completely different. It's not cultural, but how it was financed affected what then happened.
But interestingly, the V&A, of the 45 million that it cost, only 5 million came from public money, from the lottery fund, which is arguably from gambling. So the rest was raised by the V&A's development team through foundations, through private donations, through trusts. You know, an extraordinary undertaking. And in order to be able to appeal to those trusts and to release the magnitude of that funding, you need to have a powerful idea. You need to be able to talk about it with passion and to express the kind of nuance, to show why it's going to be different, why it's worth it, why it's going to be special, why you should put your name to it. So it's kind of all part of the...
But there's something interesting coming out, because I think there's a general perception, particularly around cultural institutions, new cultural institutions commissioning, that, you know, if we look back over hundreds of years, there's such a grand tradition in Europe in particular of private philanthropy. You know, if you think a lot of the patrons of great museums and great buildings and a lot of the kind of great, the sort of cultural infrastructure of Europe was often built by private interests, by aristocracy, whether it's from, you know, Renaissance Italy forwards. And I think even today there's a sense within that universe that people are allowed to take more risks when backed by private money. So it's very interesting to hear what you're saying, that actually your experience of working with the V&A, you felt that allowed you to take risks, because arguably
and I felt
that's not what people feel.
But I felt that also with Matt. I mean, I don't want our work to sound like completely risky, because nobody will ever give me a job again, but you know, EDP was a private company. It's always about your relationship in the end with the ultimate decision maker. If Antonio Machio had not been the CEO, if he and I hadn't kind of clicked, I doubt that I would have been able to persuade EDP to do what we did. Mm-hmm.
So the personal relationships in those cases were key, or that kind of chemistry.
It's absolutely key.
So I'm going to throw it back. Thank you to the IIPP leadership for anchoring the discussion. So a few questions. I want to fit everyone in the remaining 13 minutes. So maybe I could take a couple of questions at once, see if there's any common themes, and just make sure you all feel that you've got your questions answered. So I think you had a question, Adam? And then if we could send the other microphone. Oh, there's one there. And then next, if you could take the microphone over there.
I wanted to ask a question about scale, because the way that cities are getting so much bigger and greater masses of people are expected to move around, and how you deal with that. And I was thinking particularly about what's happened at Tottenham Court Road tube station, for example, because that's going to be a cross-rail space. So the way that, for example, the sort of entrance hall is now massive, and the scale of the decoration on the walls is sort of very big scale. And then you go down to the actual platform area, and you've got the old Paolozzi mosaics, and how human scale they are, and how unhuman scale the contemporary work at street level is. And really, what do you do about the human starting to feel smaller and smaller and smaller in the city space?
Well, I would disagree with you on... I think you can make beautiful, uplifting, kind of almost grandiose, cathedral-like spaces that are utterly human, and they're vast. But in the way that they're designed, they are not designed to belittle you.
I think that's what
and so I think it's just a little bit too oversimplistic to say just because something's small and low, it kind of feels right scale. But I do think scale's a very big issue when we talk about public places, because I do think the very large places, like I mentioned Trafalgar Square in front of Centre Pompidou, and there are many other examples around the world, because of their scale and because of their kind of success, that they become uncomfortable places to be. So it is as important to create lots of smaller spaces, more local spaces, with the same kind of care, that isn't about huge numbers of people coming together, but is about smaller groups coming together, or smaller communities feeling a sense of identity and belonging in a particular place. And then how do you, when you do have a very vast public space, how do you break it down and make it feel more kind of cozy in parts? And that's why I think the Place de la République is such a good example, that it is, you know, it used to be kind of two halves of an oval that had a big, you know, 4-lane traffic going through it. Now it's one vast space, but the way that they've divided it up and planted and created areas of shade and put trees, and the trees immediately kind of contain you, so you feel more kind of wrapped and protected.
You made an interesting point about appropriation and the fact that I think most of us would agree that the idea of people coming together to take part in certain activities is one of the lovely things about public space. But I'm interested in this idea of appropriation of public space by private organisations, or the sort of the handing over of public space to private organisations. I'm thinking of things like, you know, the Garden Bridge, for example, or to a degree Victoria Gardens by the Palace of Westminster, and also to a degree sort of Granary Square, which, you know, was railway land, technically public, but then handed over to a private development corporation. And trying to understand what that means. We've talked about homelessness as an issue, but also there are things like skateboarding or you know, other activities which seem to be, to some are acceptable, but to others might not be. I wonder whether you might say a bit about the way that we seem to be handing over public space to private entities who then control what takes place in them.
Well, I think, you know, we have to be very pragmatic about the times that we live in. And the kind of ideological position that, you know, true public space has to be publicly funded and anything can happen, fine. But it maybe won't be maintained. It maybe won't be managed well, and so it won't be a very pleasant place to be, or it won't even be created in the first place because there's no money to do it. I think the issue you raise of the Garden Bridge is an interesting one. If you compare the Garden Bridge, let's say, to the bridge in Lisbon, which you haven't seen because I didn't show a photo, but just believe me, it's nice. The bridge in Lisbon answered a real need for people to get across from one side of the tracks to the other, and the two bridges either side were bloody miles away. So it answered an unmet need. The Garden Bridge didn't have any reason to be for transport of people. It didn't. There's plenty of bridges. And the big, you know, whatever I may think about the Garden Bridge, the big issue there was that it would be closed a certain number of days, evenings a year for private benefit. And I think that's wrong. Now, EDP own the bridge from the square, and they maintain it, and they paid for it, but they will never close it. And you have to trust that they're not going to close it. I think appropriation is an interesting question. We, both on the roof of Lisbon and the courtyard in the V&A, I think you could argue that they're quite under-designed spaces. We didn't put in any shading, we didn't put in seating, other than, you know, just pieces that were kind of part of the architecture, if you like. And it was kind of for a reason. It was to, first of all, I think you can over-design a space and inhibit what goes on there. But also you want to see how people do use it, and where they hang out, and where they sit, and where they want to be, before you rush and try and solve everything in one go. So I'm a great believer in letting spaces evolve. Or, you know, do we plant a tree here, and where would be the best place? Not that I'm suggesting you plant a tree in the courtyard of the V&A, because I don't think that would be right, because they have many, you know, their installations and you know, and they have parties too. And they have parties that they hire out the space at night, never at a time that the museum would be open to the public, but they need revenue to keep the museums free. So you know, it's We have to be pragmatic.
And so perhaps the distinction being made is between publicly owned or publicly focused or mandated or in public interest or public value. And maybe, you know, where we focused on public is around a notion of who owns it, like a literal ownership model, rather than thinking about management. So, for example, if a kind of cooperative oversaw a space, would we have a problem with that? Even though they may be a civic entity, they may not be a public entity. So, you know, maybe the question to be teased out is ownership.
But
the definition of public.
but you gave us an example, Granary Square, and you kind of alluded, oh, it used to be a lovely kind of old Okay, but Granary Square is part of a massive commercial development, and I live and work very near there, and when it opened, I was ready to be quite cynical. You know, developer spaces are always boring. It is hugely successful, and part of its success, I have to say, is its management, because it keeps it beautiful, it keeps it very safe. It's a place that families from all around the area come to. It's not this, you know, entirely middle-class haven at all. It's a very democratic space. And once a place feels safe, then it becomes successful, because then families come, and then it just attracts a different kind of respect and sort of reciprocal respect, if you like. So, yes, I know they could close it, or, you know, but the fact that it's, you know, you have this passage through the art school that is open 24 hours a day, every day of the year. It's wonderful. I think it's a very good example of a privately owned, privately managed public space. So I take back my cynicism.
It's heartening. I know we had a question. We have two. We've only got a few minutes, but any burning questions, please put your hands up, and we'll try and rattle through so you will feel heard and seen in a very public way.
Yeah, I see that you had a few qualms about the lottery funding, wasn't it? I wonder if you had any qualms about accepting money from the Chinese energy company?
No, none at all.
Okay.
Why would I? They are they're one of the biggest energy companies in the world. They provide all the energy to Portugal. Interestingly, it became majority Chinese owned halfway through our project. And what I thought was interesting is that shift in ownership did not change the ambition or the intention at all.
I was just thinking of the environmental impact that these companies work with.
The EDP have a huge renewables program. They're really quite leading the way in their alternative energy sources. So,
and perhaps, and I know I'm going to hand it over, but perhaps also that speaks to an issue that was raised in the issue of public or private. Having worked in Africa for many years with a lot of Chinese involvement, some of it was fantastic and some of it was less fantastic. And in the end, it became less about, is this a China issue or an India issue or a Middle East issue? It was actually just the quality of the person you were engaged with. And maybe similarly, we've just talked about a private model that's better than some public models of public space management. So do we all need to perhaps embrace ideas of judging entities, individuals, and concepts and models on their own merits, rather than, you know, where do you come from, you know, you're Chinese, good or bad, public good, private bad, would be, you know, one thought. Please. I
mean, but just to answer, you know, and I did take a rather kind of alluded to a negative position about gambling, because I don't like gambling. I feel it preys on, well, you know, it preys on the most vulnerable. And funnily enough, I've just come back from a trip to Sydney, where the tallest building in Sydney on the waterfront is going to be a casino. And you just think, what is the message that amazing city is projecting to the world? You know.
Well said.
I just wanted to ask, in relation to your question, your answer about Granary Square, you said it was an incredibly successful project. I just wondered if you could maybe expand a little bit from your experience about what you consider and have seen as a successful public space.
In that space.
Just across your experience.
But, well, just to use that as an example, because I do think it's a clever piece of design. The landscaping is really beautiful. It's that a huge amount of thought and money has gone into the design of the landscaping and in the maintenance. They've also really thought about creating shade and shelter, and of course the kind of water and the sort of interactive water fountains that are so hugely popular with kids in the summer months, and which help to make that space feel a bit cooler, you know, in our wonderfully drought heat of summer. It was a really lovely place to hang out because the coolth that is reflected from the water makes a difference to the way that you feel. So I think you know, and they've thought hard about where is a nice place to sit, where do you want to be with a big crowd. They've got the steps coming down to the canal. It's, you know, there are lots of pockets of different places that feel different, that create different atmospheres. And I think that's part of the success.
I'm going to rattle through the last few. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and we're 6, and we're on 7.
Oh.
Amanda, you're too popular, Amanda. What I would love to do is maybe we could literally just take the questions back to back, because some of them may repeat each other and so on. If the audience don't mind us going on a few extra moments to give everyone that chance to speak, is that okay with you? Mm-hmm. Is that okay with the boss? Fantastic. So really quick questions, less statements, more questions.
Hello. Yeah,
Fantastic.
just a very quick question about BIM methodology in public spaces. Has that been a benefit and to your practice, digital construction methodologies, or has it been a hindrance?
I'm not sure I really understand the question. Sorry.
So in terms of risk mitigation, I was particularly looking at the 2D diagram that you showed, the complexity of the engineering solution.
Yeah.
When you're trying to sell to a client a vision, the mandation of BIM technologies, BIM 2 especially, in the last, I think, 18 months from government procurement perspective, does that mitigate risk, or has it just been another thing that, as a practice, you have to embrace and understand and invest in?
I think it makes once everyone's trained up on BIM, which we all now are, it makes things much easier because BIM, just for those of you who don't know, it's about a coordinated three-dimensional model so that every discipline, whether it's the engineering, the services, the architecture, everything is coordinated from the very beginning. So if there's a clash, it's immediate. I'm just being simplistic, but it's immediately apparent. It certainly makes clients, I think, feel more comfortable and a bit safer, but it doesn't eradicate risk entirely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that impressive talk. My question is about how a designer or an architect have a say or have an impact on the way that these public spaces are managed or governed through time, because I think it's really important in order to keep that vision through time.
When you hand over a building, it's a bit like saying goodbye to your child who's just left home. You kind of have to let it go. But at the V&A, for example, I've been having conversations about you're not keeping that courtyard clean enough, and maybe we should, look at a different cleaning methodology. And so we're doing some research and finding the right pads for the cleaners so that it'll look nicer. But yeah.
Thank you. There's one here and also one at the back, and there was a gentleman in the middle, and there was a lady here, and then I think we... But very quick, thank you.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask about if you had a sense, or the V&A had a sense of who...
I don't know whether... Oh, sorry.
Of who were the kind of diversity or the spread of people that were accessing the courtyard in the V&A. So I suppose what I'm hinting at is it's kind of located in one of the richest boroughs in the city, one of the richest places in the country. Does its locality make it exclusive?
No, I think what I didn't mention was that the visitor numbers at the V&A are up 26%. That is phenomenal, and that is since the courtyard entrance has been open. And this is at a time where museum attendance in London is actually going down, not up. And Tristram Hunt has come out publicly and said that this is in large part due to the design of the courtyard and it being a very much more informal way of entering a museum. He talked about it being less scary and therefore kind of inviting maybe new audiences. I don't know whether they've done any research into whether it's altered or improved the diversity of the audience, but it's certainly hugely increased visitor numbers, and that's something I feel very proud of.
Thank you so much. We have the lady here. Oh, sorry, and why don't you go ahead while she gets the microphone? Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Here. Yeah, just on this public-private thing. I mean, so it seems, I'm not an expert on this, but it seems like most of your projects, the source of funding ultimately has been philanthropic private sector funding, even if it's a public client, as the case with the V&A. Obviously, we did used to have more of a tradition of, you know, municipalities spending big on big, brave buildings and public spaces. And so I just wondered, do you think that that's a problem? Because it sort of sounds as though you don't think it's necessarily a problem, but I just wondered if you've thought about that in a more general sense and a historical sense as well, changed through time.
I mean, they were glorious days when the municipality and where, you know, local government architecture practices, they were, you know, look at the South Bank. That was the LCC. Amazing architecture came out, an amazing visionary thinking. But it's very hard to imagine that we will ever get that back. You know, maybe Mariana, you know, it's, but I...
Practice who, you know, are now part of our group are actually all about that, bringing back those big thinking architects and designers into government.
Okay.
It's not possible. You know, where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah.
But if there's a self-fulfilling prophecy, the more we downscale our thinking of what the public's for, the less people actually want to...
But then where's the money coming from?
Well, when we want to go to war, the money's not.
Great. I'm with you.
It was someone. Did you want the microphone? Someone waited from the middle.
I had one more question.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about value of public space, so with stuff like ownership and appropriation of public spaces, I'm interested in. So you mentioned the example of shopping malls, and like if we're building places that function like malls, what makes it a public space, or what's crucial for it to be not taken over by retail or retailers, but then make it possible to be like a public space?
I can't really... I pose it as a question that I can't answer, but I think it's an interesting talking point. And I do think that we have to be kind of open to a more fluid way of understanding public space through how people, you know, how people use and choose to use buildings. And I... You know, in Asia, the mall, it is part of the culture. It's not part of the culture here, so I'm not suggesting that it is a successful model here at all. But in Asia, it is, and it works, and therefore, you know, is that? I'm just asking the question kind of to all of you, does that make it a public space? You don't have to go and spend money. Does the fact that a shop like a department store like Galeries Lafayette have so many more millions of visitors than the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre, does that in any way make it public? You know, the Louvre's a public building, but you have to pay to enter it. I mean, there are so many complexities that it's no longer black and white. We have to be open to different models and models that will develop over time.
And so the recurring theme that seems to be coming up here is public space, not as publicly owned space, but publicly used space. I mean, what's the definition we could hone in on? It's the place the public feels able to use, feels able to appropriate, and actually that's not about an ownership model maybe it's about a management model, or maybe it's just about where the public see themselves. But definitely, and I'm sure the Institute is thinking about this in very progressive ways, but maybe the idea of public space needs to be redefined. And the gentleman here, thank you all for your patience in this micro-marathon of questions. Please, your final question.
Yeah. I'd like to ask if your experience of those two quite marvellous projects has changed or developed in any way your view of the value of public spaces And if so, what might be the influence on your future projects?
It's hugely changed. I mean, we've changed ourselves because in both cases, we were much more, we invested the projects with an ambition beyond the brief. And I feel very strongly, having now successfully completed those 2 projects, that every project that we do, whatever scale, whoever owns it, whoever commissions it, you have to think beyond the confines of the site. And, if we take museums, I mean, museums in the 21st century they have to engage with contemporary life. They have to communicate beyond their buildings, beyond their walls. And I don't just mean digitally, I mean in a more kind of visceral way. So I think what I have learned is to think very hard and very seriously about, at every scale, both a kind of micro and macro, how we can make the space around the building and the connection between the building and the streets, how we can make it better for everyone.
And that is the generosity and kind of integrity that I think we all associated you with, and after today will forevermore associate you with. So I want to, on behalf of everybody here, thank Amanda, not just, as you can see, an extraordinary architect of our time, but a great civic influence, I think it's fair to say, a great citizen, both of London and the world.
Oh.
So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.